Hear the word of the Lord. The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Get situated here. You earn the Labor Day star. Instead of being at the lake, enjoying barbecue, or whatever everybody else is doing, you are here. And just as a fun thought for you, Kelly and I are watching this show. I'm not exactly sure what the name of the show is. It's something about living a long time. Live to 100. And so they're going through and finding these places called blue zones, which are areas where the life expectancy is a lot longer than it is in other places. And one of the things that they mentioned on there is something that I've heard before, is that regular church attendance, and by that they mean attending church once a week, can add up to 7 years to your life. Can you believe that? So you're adding to your life by being here today. 7 years. You get 7 extra years just because you're here today. I don't know if that's how it works, but it is certainly interesting. The other thing that's really interesting is we've only watched a couple of episodes, but all of these communities that they're interviewing people, they come from different religious backgrounds, but spirituality and prayer is always a strong thing in these communities where these people are living longer. So take that for what it's worth, but you're in a good place regardless. So this morning, I want to take you back to one of the top 10 days of my life. Okay? Now, I am married, so 2 of those days of the top 10, one is when I met my wife, the second is when we got married. Thank you. I have 3 children, right? So when they were born, that makes 5 days. So we're talking about, other than those life-changing events, one of the 5 most memorable days of my life. And this day takes place in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I was invited over to a friend's house for lunch. They cooked what I'm sure was a delicious meal, but it wasn't the meal that I remembered from that day. They were wonderful cooks, and they invited us over many times, and we ate many delicious meals with them. On top of that, I have had the blessing to experience many different great restaurants over my life. And so while the meal, I'm sure, was delicious, that's not what I remembered. What I remembered was that after we finished eating our meal, my friend John got up from the table that we were at, disappeared into the kitchen, and returned with the smallest oranges that I have ever seen in my life. He asked me if I had ever eaten a clementine, to which my response was, I don't even know what that is, so the answer is no. Now, my grandmother is an orange connoisseur. She made my grandpa take her from Oklahoma to Florida every January so that she could eat delicious oranges. And so I have tasted some really good oranges at my grandma's house. But I'd never eaten a clementine up until that point in my life. So John handed me 2, and he showed me how to peel them. And they were easy to peel, and they were super delicious and cute little oranges. But my life changed when that miniature orange slice hit my tongue. And this was the best citrus fruit that I had experienced up to that point in my life. Now, I don't know what exact day of January that day was, but it was towards the end of January, because as I did some research, clementines, their harvest season ends right at the end of January. So I marked on my calendar the middle of December the following year where they would be back in season and I could get another one of those delicious oranges. The problem, though, is that I was not the only one that year that experienced the goodness of a clementine. And as more and more people experienced how good they can be, they became more and more in demand and more available. And they started sourcing them from all over the world. And what I've found out since is that there are several varieties of oranges that look like clementines, but are frauds. They're not real clementines. They come from areas of Spain and they're different types of mandarins. And so they are not just as good. They're readily available any time of the year, not just December through January. And that seems like a good thing for somebody who loves clementines. Yet, what tends to happen is that because they're not fresh from California, which is the only place in the world, to my knowledge, that you grow clementines, and this variety is, they don't taste the same, and they're not as good. And every once in a while, you might get an in-season clementine when it is their season. But overall, the quality has diminished. And I've never been able to taste what I tasted that first day. You know, we live in the golden day of options. We can have almost anything we want, whenever we want it, just a few hours away. It doesn't matter what time of year it is. It doesn't matter where we live. And when we need something or we want something, this is a grand reality. But when we step back and we examine the situation, we don't often think about what this new world that we live in costs. Options and availability appear as good things, but they do cost us something. Yes, when you go to the grocery store, you are able to find a fruit that looks like a clementine, no matter what time of year you shop for it. But if you have ever had a fresh in-season clementine, you don't know what you are missing out by eating those little oranges when they're not in season. And having been a pastor now for almost 20 years, I've had the privilege of mentoring several people. One of them in particular, many years ago, had a few bad habits that he came to me and decided that he wanted to change. He wanted to stop participating in these habits. So I would meet with him regularly and we would talk through this. One time I met with him and he came in sort of dejected, he was upset. And as I was speaking with him, he said, I don't even think that I really want to give these things up anymore. They're really not that bad. They can, I can figure out all these reasons. And he started justifying why these things that at one point he wanted to get rid of were no longer negative in his life. I think that in mentoring situations and really in many situations in life, that asking good questions oftentimes leads to more transformation than trying to convince somebody that what you are telling them is right. So as he went through this justification that he had for continuing the habits that at one time he wanted to quit, I began praying for God to give me the right question to ask him. And what I ended up saying was, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So the real question is not what you are able to do or not what you can justify doing, but what should you do? This was one of those moments where I look back, and this was a light bulb moment, not only for him, but also for me. And actually, that has become a saying for me that I ask myself when trying to make a decision that I don't know what the right answer is just because you can, does it mean that you should? I have asked myself that many times. Just because we can have a year-round supply of clementines at the grocery store doesn't mean that we should. Now, this sermon and what Jesus said in John is not about oranges. right? There's something more going on here. But in the same way that we can talk about convenience and options, Jesus is making in these I am statements an exclusive argument that God's way is the most true and leads to the most whole and full lives. While there might be other ways for us that we can justify living in competition with God just because we can, doesn't mean that we should. Jesus invites us to see him and how the result of following him leads to the fullness of life that there is no other way that offers. So I want to reread this scripture that Jeremy read earlier. But before we do that, I want to invite you to take just a couple of deep breaths so that we can prepare to hear Jesus' words. And so I can find it here in the Bible. Before we read, let me take a moment and pray. Jesus, we are about to read words which you spoke. So may we not hear these as we hear any other words, but hear them from your mouth today. Jesus said, "The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." In the golden days of options, we can find clementines year-round. We can find information on any worldview that we want. Literally, whatever information we desire is located in your pocket or in your purse or in your backpack. All the questions that we could want answers to, we have access to. And while this, in many ways, is a great thing, at some point we have to ask the question, what does it cost us? Just because we can, does it mean that we should? Now, I'm speaking this morning from the perspective of trusting Jesus. We've been in this series where we're asking the question, who is God? And the hope is that through examining these statements that Jesus made, that we would have a better understanding of who God is, and in the meanwhile, learning how much more than we believed at the beginning that God is trustworthy. So when we're thinking about access to all of these different things, we immediately think about how the reason why we have this access is because of technology, right? Please hear me today. I am not anti-technology. I am not anti-Google, though they are tracking everything that you do. I am not anti-social media. I am not even anti-social gurus for the most part. I attempt to steer clear from any sort of culture war that is being waged in our society. But at the same time, I have a deep desire to trust Jesus more each day. And I believe that the way of Jesus is trustworthy. And for me, each day is an opportunity to trust Jesus more. And so in this pursuit, I have realized that there are portions of my life where I need to trust Jesus more. Portions of my life where I have been lulled into patterns that are contrary to that of Jesus. Patterns that I am told that will lead to satisfaction, but really only serve as a distraction. Patterns where contentment is just out of reach, just on the other side of this purchase, or just on the other side of that achievement. And because I am easily distracted, even when I don't realize it, I from now on want to be a person who examines and evaluates all the areas of my life through the way of Jesus. Now, what I have described is not a new thing. It's not brought on by technology. It actually has been around since the very beginning. It's what the New Testament writers called the war with the flesh. It's what the psychologist Freud would call our unconscious drives. It's being driven to do something, whether we understand what is leading us to this decision or not. We are constantly bombarded by stories that compete with the way of Jesus, and all of us are prone to be allured to whatever it is that they are offering. We don't act by what we should do as much as we do by what we are able to or what we have access to. But Jesus offers us another way. And these I am statements are the dividing line between Jesus and the kingdom of God on one side, and the priest of his day and the Roman Empire, and what Paul would later term the patterns of the world on the other. And as we learn to trust Jesus more, we learn the depths at which we are influenced by the patterns of the world, which lead us in opposite directions of the kingdom of God, and opposite even of oftentimes of the end that is enticing us there in the first place. So when we read Galatians 5, we read about the fruits of the Spirit, which is a thing that we use at Journey to evaluate how we are doing and following the way of Jesus, not only as individuals, but also as the church. Galatians 5 says this: the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Right? So we realize that these fruits are what result from us living in the kingdom of God. These fruits cannot be developed by life hacks learned on YouTube. They aren't developed by thinking positive thoughts or speaking them into existence. They aren't developed by reading the latest pop psychology or trusting the wisdom of an influencer or even trusting half-hearted religious-sounding tropes. These fruits are developed in one way and in one way only as a byproduct of the Spirit's work in our lives. So being present with Jesus, being shaped by Jesus, and doing what Jesus did, this is what produces these fruits in our lives. This truth is what has led me to the realization of what I often share with you all, that what is good for Jesus is good for me. It truly does not matter if what is good for Jesus fits into all the other influences in my life. If something in my life doesn't align with the way of Jesus, if it doesn't produce the fruit of the Spirit, then at best it's a half-truth. And at worst, it is an outright lie. It is a distraction. And it comes from a thief, as Jesus says in John 10:10. The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. So as Jesus confronted the priests of his day, as he confronted the influence of the idea that might makes right, as he confronted the occupation of the Roman Empire and the patterns of this world, we too must see these statements as a confrontation in our day. Jesus is inviting us to trust him above everything else and to submit to him being the Lord of our lives. So the question then that we have to wrestle with, and this is not a question that I can wrestle with for you. It's a question that you have to wrestle with on your own or by yourself, but also we can do this as a community. And the question is, how or why should we trust Jesus? Now, truthfully, there are lots of other ways out there that promise to lead us to whatever that way's version of the promised land is. And as each day goes on, something else is invented or something else rises to the top that we are able to discover. There are lots of other truths which claim wholeness and peace. There are even lots of Jesus and beliefs out there that give you the best of both worlds. You can have all the benefits of the kingdom of heaven, plus whatever you fancy during your time on earth. So why then should we trust Jesus exclusively when there are all these other options out there? For me, the answer to that question comes down to this verse in John 10:11. And not just because Jesus spoke these words, but because then Jesus went from there and lived them out with his life. In John 10:11, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now the priests in this confrontation, they were full of advice, which they believed in and acted upon, but it led to their personal ascent and their personal gain. The result of their leadership was that people on the outside of their boundaries were being manipulated and being used for the benefit of them and others like them. The Roman Empire had lots of beliefs and truths, and they had the power to make their way unfold before them. But the result of their leadership was that people on the outside of their boundaries were being manipulated and used for Rome's benefit and the benefit of others like Rome. And for both the priests of Jesus' day and the Romans, there was a just stream of lives that had been trampled and discarded in the wake of them moving forward. They were considered casualties in order for Rome to prosper, or in order for the priest's way to prosper. But this is not so with Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Jesus' path was that though he was God, he didn't consider himself being God something to exalt himself, but instead gave his life away so that others might live. Why? Because this is what the Good Shepherd does. The result of Jesus' leadership is that there isn't anyone to draw boundaries against, because there's no reason to manipulate or use anyone. And the reason why he doesn't have to manipulate or use anyone is because he's not on an ascent above anyone else. Jesus is not out to gain power and influence to better himself and others like him. He's offering a way to others to be fully present and to be at peace and to be fully alive. A way of comprehending God's love and being able to practice that love towards our neighbors. This is why I trust Jesus above everything else. This is why I say what is good for Jesus is good for me. Maybe the reason why contentment is always out of reach for us as a society is because we are on the wrong path. For Father's Day, back at the beginning of the summer, Kelly and the kids took me to a Rangers game. And if you've been to the new Rangers Stadium, there's not just a new stadium, they're like building a whole new city down there. And so everything is under construction. And not just road construction, there's skyscraper buildings being built. And so there's these huge construction sites everywhere that you look. And so wherever you find a place to park, it can make it interesting for you to get to where you need to go to the stadium. And so we parked where we normally do when we go to the Rangers game. But the path that we normally walk on to get to the stadium was closed. So we had to maneuver down around the path and around the pond and up the grass, up a big hill, and then finally found our way back on the path. And so as we were doing that, I was looking around to try to find a better way for us to get back to our vehicle when the game was over. And so I saw what I thought was the sidewalk that we could take to lead back around to where we needed to be. And so when we left the game, I said to Kelly, we don't want to go down and walk all the way around the grass and over the lake and around the corner and, through the dark. We want to go around this way. So we kept going on the path that I knew led to where we wanted to go. But it didn't. And the crazy thing is that about halfway down this path, I realized that more than likely this was not going to get us to where we needed to go. But I did not, in that realization, turn around. I kept going because if it did lead to where we wanted to go, then all would be well. And then I could say, see, I told you so. But as you know, that is not at all what happened. We got all the way to the end, to the point to where we figured out that we couldn't go any further, and said, I'm sorry, we got to go all the way back. But then I figured out, hey, there's a little opening in that gate right there. And we can walk through there and get to where we needed to go. And Kelly said, no, we are absolutely not doing that. We are walking back. So we walked all the way back. And we walked down the hill without the sidewalk and around the lake and through the dark and back to where we were supposed to go. And do you know what we saw when we got to the parking lot? We saw another dad and his kid and another guy who were literally trapped inside of the construction place because they tried to cut through as we were going to, but they didn't have Kelly there to save them. Sometimes we see another path and we realize that it's the wrong path, or we realize that it probably doesn't lead to the place that we think that it is, but it is enticing enough for us to start down it. And if we start down that path, we can get going and we can know that it's not going where we thought that it was going to lead, but we just keep on going because we just think that we can push through and make it happen and figure it out once we get there. And then we get to a point sometimes where we try to cut corners and we end up trapped in a maze that we are unable to get out of. The great spiritual writer Thomas Merton said that most people spend their lives climbing the ladder of success only to find once they reach the top that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. When the priests heard Jesus making these claims about being the Good Shepherd, we read their response in John 10, verses 19 through 21. Here's what it says. In 19 it says, the Jews were divided when they heard these words. In verse 20 it says, many of them said, he is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why should we listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Now we know from the rest of Jesus' story that the former eventually got their way. Those who claimed that Jesus was demon-possessed and raving mad eventually convinced those who saw the miraculous power of Jesus that Jesus was not who he said that he was. And in the end, they had their way. Yet what the Good Shepherd knows is that when the patterns of the world are playing the game of power, who eventually makes it to the top is in the wrong place. Because resurrection assures us that at the bottom, at the broken, in the discarded, and the left for dead, that they will live again. Because while the power brokers of this world might be in control of who dies, God is the author of life, which even death cannot touch. So the question for us today is, in whom do we trust? Those that Jesus calls thieves that come to steal and kill and destroy, regardless of how good it looks. Or the shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep.